Our first speaker is Paul Bernstein, who's a private attorney. He's also a member of the board of the Metropolitan Tenants Organization. Paul is going to speak about representing tenants from a private attorney's perspective. Paul?
Thank you, Professor Rose, and thank you for all of you being here. Professor Rose has a multifaceted participation here. As you've heard, he was the co-author of the RLTO and the moving force, along with a wonderful staff who have made this what hopefully will be a very, very productive day. By way of, I want to give you some background that I think is important to understand some of the challenges and some of the solutions that we see for all of us that are here today. First of all, and I didn't know this until a couple of years ago, that healthy, affordable, and safe housing is not a right in the United States of America. It's considered a privilege, which means you've got to earn it. Of course, there's lots of people who can't earn it or never will be capable of earning it, but that sets us apart. Like the Kyoto Treaty, we're not a member of that either anymore. I think we're the only industrialized country in the world that believes that affordable, safe housing is a privilege and not a right. One thing is kind of an overview. When I was a very, very young lawyer, one of the benefits I had is that my uncle was a lawyer, and through him, even as a very young person and a young lawyer, I met some of the then finest lawyers in the city of Chicago. One of whom was Meyer Weinberg, who was the dean of divorce work. And if you are old enough to have done divorce work in the 50s and 40s and early 60s, he literally wrote the book. And it happened I had a case with Meyer once, and being a young lawyer, I was very aggressive and very adamant, and he was getting me a little bit angry, and he took me aside in a private room, and he said, Paul, and he could talk to me this way because he knew me as a kid growing up. So I want you to remember something. He said, remember that before we were lawyers, we were human beings. The fact that we became lawyers has not changed that fact. And when you think about that a little bit, I think it's as an overview of some of the things that we're facing, that's something that's worth remembering. A lot of the younger lawyers grew up with Perry Mason. And if you saw the movie A Few Good Men at the end, where Tom Cruise becomes a real trial lawyer and successful, he goes into the courtroom and he looks at it and says something like, this is what a courtroom looks like. He had never been in a courtroom before. What we're going to be talking about in my brief period of time is some of the practicalities of becoming lawyers and how to do it. I must also mention that when I first got out of DePaul Law School, I started to interview with a number of firms, and one was a very large firm, and I asked, what do you do with lawyers? And the response was, well, we put you in the library, and you do what lawyers do in libraries. I said, for how long? 2 years. And what do you do after 2 years? I was already set on not going with that firm because I wanted to be a lawyer, like Perry Mason and some of the other lawyers on TV. He says, well, Mr. Bernstein, we're very proud of the fact, this was an old line law firm, I think they're still around, we have never fired a lawyer in our firm. I said, what do you mean? He says, well, after 2 years, to answer your question, we think you're doing okay and we like you, we take you out of the library. If we don't like you or aren't happy with your work, we leave you there, and you would quit if we didn't get you out of the library. So they had never fired anybody. I thought that was terrific, and I left politely but quickly. We're living in a society with a lot of tenants now. They watch Judge Judy, and they watch all the other lawyer shows. And a lot of tenants come to court without lawyers. First of all, we don't have the best reputations in the world. That's false. It's wrong. It's another topic, but it exists. People generally don't like lawyers. All the comedians have anti-lawyer jokes. But they watch Judge Judy, and they think if they come prepared, they're going to get, between commercials, Judge Judy type of treatment from the judges, and the judges are going to listen and rule fairly. And part of this Lawyers Committee report that Professor Rose mentioned earlier, talking about, one of the primary purposes of a report they've done called No Time for Justice was to talk about how long it takes an eviction trial if the tenant is there pro se. The answer, less than 2 minutes. less than 2 minutes. There was a secondary part of it, which said that in about 200 or 300 of those cases, tenants alleged a good defense to the eviction. And guess how many of those tenants out of 200 or 300 won the case? The answer is 0, absolutely 0. And that's the Waters Committee for Better Housing, not Paul Bernstein. Part of the problem we're facing is that I'm always surprised at how few tenants actually know that they have rights. They don't know there's an RLTO. They don't know that they have rights, and because of that, they often do the wrong thing in contravention of what they should do under the RLTO. Part of what happens with eviction, and this varies from state to state, but in Illinois, it's a very swift process, and I'll cover that briefly for those of you who aren't that familiar with the eviction process. But in many cases today, it means homelessness. It means a traumatic change of family. And as I'll point out to you very, very quickly, this can happen in 30 days, in the 30-day period, giving people no time to even begin to make other arrangements. One of the interesting cases, and I again cite this to excite your imaginations, hopefully, and focus on what we're going to talk about and demonstrate the need for lawyers and why lawyers should get involved here, is I was sitting in one courtroom, and I won't mention the courtroom number because I wouldn't want to embarrass the judge. And I'm sitting there waiting for a commercial case I was involved with to be continued. And there was a residential tenant, and the case was called, and both the landlord and the tenant were pro se. And the landlord, not because I represent tenants, but I didn't have to be a tenant advocate to see that the landlord was really a bad guy. You could tell he'd been in court a lot, he swaggered, he had a scowl on his face. He walked up to the bench with his 5-day notice waving in the air. He was ready to do one of these less than 2-minute trials. The woman who was there was a young African-American woman who had 3 children, a single mom, working, going to school, trying to pull herself up by her bootstraps. And the trial essentially went like this. The landlord said, and give away part of the presentation, she didn't pay the rent. I served her a 5-day notice. Here's the 5-day notice. It's in proper form. I waited the 5 days and a little bit more. I filed this case, and here I am, and I want her evicted. And he had done. Those are the essential. And he said, I'm the owner of the property. The judge turned to the tenant. He says, do you have anything to say? She says, yes, I do. He says, here's what happened. There's cockroaches in my apartment. There's no heat when there ought to be in my apartment. She listed a series of other things. And she was believable. She was a believable person. She had pictures of deplorable conditions. And she talked about the fact that she couldn't even sleep at night because her children are very young and she had to protect them from things that crawl in the middle of the night so that they wouldn't have problems with these things over her body and the like. And she said, I didn't know what to do. I called them. I called the city. They even came out, and then things seemed to get a bit better. But he wouldn't do anything. And then I didn't pay the rent. Now, she didn't know about the Chicago Ordinance and what to do. And that's why he sued me for eviction, and that's why I think I shouldn't be evicted. The judge turns and he looks at the landlord. He says, what have you got to say about this? And at this point, this guy kind of lost his temper. He says, she's right. Yes, she called the city on me. I knew about it. They came out. They fined me. They made me make all these changes and do all this work. It cost me thousands of dollars. That's why I terminated her month-to-month lease, even though she's been a tenant of mine for several years.